Hello, welcome to Peter Reads Books. It's Sunday, it's 3. I'm slightly hungover because I got more drunk than I should have been last night. More than I planned to, but that's life. We're reading Riders of the Purple Sage by Zane Grey. It's a Western that seems to be like the typical Western, how it's supposed to be. And in the beginning, you can sort of see why. It has good guys and bad guys and Mormons and horses and stuff. So that's all that. We meet Ventus and Jane Witherstein in the beginning. The first 2 chapters we read last week. And Ventus is a non-Mormon, and Jane Witherstein is a Mormon. And she's liked him and tried to save him and gave him some work and some stuff. But apparently nobody likes him because he was a Gentile, a non-Mormon, and everybody in the community, or specific people in the community, a guy called, what was his name? Toll is the sheriff, I think, or something, and he doesn't like him and he tries to get him away. But Lassiter came along, who apparently is just like an evil Mormon killer or something, but he's a good evil Mormon killer. He's one of the heroes, and he came along and he saved them, and that's pretty much where we are now. Both Ventus and Lassiter went out into the sage fields around the estate that Jane has. Jane Witherstein has this huge estate, and she's very rich, and she's sort of the queen of the Mormons in that area, and she helps everybody, and she's just so good. That's like quintessentially what it is happening in the story, is that everybody who's good is just really good. Everybody who's bad is just really bad, and people are like rugged, they're really rugged, and they're like, yeah. Jane and Ventus sat around talking for a bit afterwards, where there was a lot of exposition. There's a lot of exposition, just blatantly everywhere. We're going to see one in the beginning of this chapter as well. But Ventus afterward leaves, and he sees Aldring, who is a rustler. He's a cattle thief, and he sees him with a masked rider, and we're going to see that again. But I hear about that again. And he is in Deception Pass. We hear about that as well. We're going to hear about it a lot, Deception Pass. Anyway, that's where we are. Where Ventus has just left Jane Witherstein. And let's continue with chapter 3, Amber Spring. No unusual circumstances was it for Aldring and some of his men to visit Cottonwoods in the broad light of day, but for him to prowl about in the dark with the hoofs of his horses muffled meant that mischief was brewing. Moreover, to Ventus the presence of the masked rider with Aldring seemed especially ominous. For about this man there was mystery. He seldom rode through the village, and when he did ride through, it was swiftly. Riders seldom met by day on the sage, but wherever he rode, there always followed deeds as dark and mysterious as the mask he wore. That's just blatant exposition and setup again. Like, who must this masked rider be? We are probably gonna hear about him before we figure out. We're gonna meet him before we figure out that he's the rider. Aldring's band did not confine themselves to the rustling of cattle. Ventus lay down in the shade of the cottonwoods, pondering this chance meeting, and not for many moments did he consider it safe to move on. Then, with sudden impulse, he turned the other way and went back along the grove. When he reached the path leading to Jane's home, he decided to go down to the village, so he hurried onward with quick, soft steps. Once beyond the grove, he entered the one and only street. It was wide, lined with tall poplars, and under each row of trees inside the footpath were ditches where ran the water from Jane Withersteen's spring. Between the trees twinkled lights of cottage candles, and far down flared bright windows on the village doors. When Ventus got close to these, he saw knots of men standing together in earnest conversation. The usual lounging in the corners and benches and steps was not in evidence. Keeping in the shadow, Ventus went closer and closer until he could hear voices, but he could not distinguish what was said. He recognized many Mormons and looked hard for Tull and his men, but looked in vain. Ventus concluded that the rustlers had not passed along the village street. No doubt these earnest men were discussing Lassiter's coming. But Ventus felt positive that Tull's intention towards himself that day had not been and would not be revealed. So Ventus, seeing there was little for him to learn, began retracing his steps. The church was dark. Bishop Dyer's home next to it was also dark, and likewise Tull's cottage. Upon almost any night at this hour, there would be lights here, and Ventus marked the unusual omission. Perhaps Bishop Dyer is out on the field with the Aldrin guy. He might wear a mask and just be like a cartoonish, altogether unpleasant guy, or something. I don't know. It's easy to say anything because nobody knows yet. I haven't read more than the chapters that we read, so I read them the first time as well when you hear them here. As he was about to pass out on the street to skirt the grove, he once more slunk down at the sound of trotting horses. Presently he descried 2 mounted men riding towards him. He hugged the shadow of a tree. Again the starlight, brighter now, aided him, and he made out Tull's stalwart figure, and beside him the short, frog-like shape of the rider Jerry. They were silent, and they rode on to disappear. Ventus went his way with busy, gloomy mind, revolving events of the day, trying to reckon those brooding in the night. His thoughts overwhelmed him. Up in that dark grove dwelt a woman who had been his friend, and he skulked about her home, gripping a gun stealthily as an Indian, a man without a place or people or purpose. Above her hovered the shadow of grim, hidden, secret power. No queen could have given more royally out to of a bounteous store than Jane Witherstein gave her people, and likewise to those unfortunates whom her people hated. She asked only the divine right of all women, freedom to love and to live as her heart willed, and yet prayer and her hope were in vain. And yet prayer and her hope were vain. For years I've seen a storm clouding over her and the village of Cottonwoods, muttered Winters, as he strode on. Soon it'll burst. I don't like the prospects. You're not in a movie, mate. You can just think it. You don't have to mutter to yourself. That night the villagers whispered in the streets, hopefully among each other, not just to themselves. It'd just be a long muttering of everybody in the streets. It's going to go around like a plague. And night riding rustlers muffled horses, and Tull was at work in secret. And out there in the sage hid a man who meant something terrible. Lassiter. Ventus passed the black cottonwoods, and entering the sage, climbed the gradual slope. He kept his direction in line with the western star. From time to time he stopped to listen, and heard only the usual familiar bark of coyote and sweep of wind and rustles of sage. Presently a low jumble of rocks loomed up darkly somewhat to his right, and turning that way he whistled softly. Out of the rocks glided a dog that leaped and whined about him. He climbed over a rough, broken rock, picking his way carefully, and then went down. Here it was darker and sheltered from the wind. A white object guided him. It was another dog, and this one was asleep, curled up between a saddle and a pack. The animal awoke and thumped his tail in greetings. Ventus placed the saddle for a pillow, rolled in his blankets, with his face turned upwards to the stars. The white dog snuggled close to him. The other whined and patted a few yards to the right of the ground, and there crouched on guard. And in that wild covert, Ventus shut his eyes under the great white stars and intense vaulted blue, bitterly comparing their loneliness to his own, and fell asleep. When he awoke, day had dawned, and all about him was bright steel grey. The air had a cold tang. Arising, he greeted the fawning dogs and stretched his cramped body, and then, gathering together bunches of dead sage sticks, he lighted a fire. Strips of dried beef held to the blaze for a moment served him and the dogs. He drank from a canteen. There was nothing else in his outfit. He had grown used to a scant fire. Then he sat over the fire, palms outspread, and waited. Waiting had been his chief occupation for months, and he scarcely knew what he was waiting for, unless it was the passing of the hours. But now he sensed action in the immediate present. The day promised another meeting with Lassiter and Jane, perhaps news of the rustlers. On the morrow, he meant to take the trail to Deception Pass. And while he waited, he talked to his dogs. He called them Ring and Whitey. They were sheepdogs, half collie, half deerhound, superb in build, perfectly trained. It seemed that in his fallen fortunes, these dogs understood the nature of their value to him, and governed their affection and faithfulness accordingly. Whitey watched him with the somber eyes of love, and Ring, crouched on the little rise of ground above, kept tireless guard. When the sun rose, the white dog took place of the other, and Ring went to sleep at his master's feet. By and by, Ventus rolled up his blankets and tied them and his meager pack together, then climbed out to look for his horse. He saw him presently a little way off in the sage, and went to fetch him. In that country, where every rider boasted a fine mount, and was eager for a race, where thoroughbreds dotted the wonderful grazing ranges, Ventus rode a horse that was a sad proof of his misfortunes. A horse has feelings too, mate. Maybe it doesn't like you either. You consider that. Maybe you're the bastard who just likes dogs more. Speciest. That's not what they're called. I don't know. Then, with his back against the stone, Ventus faced the east, and stick in hand and idle blade, he waited. A glorious sunlight filled the valley with purple fire. Before him, to the left, to right, waving, rolling, sinking, rising, like low swells of a purple sea, stretched the sage. Out of the grove over the cottonwoods, a green patch of the purple gleamed the dull red of Jane Withersteen's old stone house, and from there extended the wide green of the village gardens and village gardens and orchards marked by the graceful poplars, and farther down shone the deep, dark richness of the alfalfa fields. Numberless red and black and white dots speckled the sage, and these were cattle and horses. So, watching and waiting, Ventus let the time wear by. At length he saw a horse rise above a ridge, and he knew it to be Lassiter's Black. Climbing to the highest rock so that he would show against the skyline, he stood and waved his hat. The almost instant turning of Lassiter's horse attested to the quickness of that rider's eye. Then Ventus climbed down, saddled his horse, tied on his pack, and, with a word to his dogs, was about to ride out to meet Lassiter, when he concluded to wait for him there on higher ground where the outlook was commanding. It had been long since Ventus had experienced friendly greeting from a man. Lassiter's warmed in him something that had grown cold from neglect, and when he had returned it with the strong grip of the iron hand that held his, and met the grey eyes, he knew that Lassiter and he were to be friends. Just like Pinkie Pie and Twilight Sparkle, I assume. "Ventus, let's talk a while before we go down there," said Lassiter, slipping his bridle. "I ain't in no hurry. Them's sure fine dogs you've got." With a rider's eye, he took in the points of Ventus' horse, but did not speak his thought. "Well, did anything come off after I left you last night?" Ventus told him about the rustlers. "I was snug hid in the sage," replied Lassiter, "and didn't see or hear no one. Aldrin's got a high hand here, I reckon. It's no news up in Utah now how he holes in canyons and leaves no track." Lassiter was silent a moment. "Me and Aldrin wasn't exactly strangers some years back when he drove cattle into Bustle's Ford at the head of Rio Virgin. But he got harassed there, and now he drives someplace else." "Lassiter, you knew him. Tell me, is he Mormon or Gentile?" "I can't say. I've known Mormons who pretended to be Gentiles." "No Mormon ever pretended that, unless he was a rustler," declared Ventus. "Maybe so. It's a hard country for anyone, but hardest for Gentiles. Did you ever know or hear of a Gentile prospering in a Mormon community?" asked Ventus. "I never did." "Well, I want to get out of Utah. I have a mother living in Illinois. I want to go home. It's 8 years now." The older man's sympathy moved Ventus to tell his story. He had left Quincy, run off to seek his fortune in the gold fields, had never gotten any farther than Salt Lake City, wandered here and there as helper, teamster, shepherd, and drifted southward over the divide and across the barrens and up the rugged plateau through the passes to the last border settlements. Here he became a rider of the sage, had stock of his own, and for a time prospered, until chance threw him in the employ of Jane Withersteen. Lassiter, I needn't tell you the rest. Well, it'd be no news to me. I know Mormons. I've seen that woman's strange love and patience, sacrifice and silence, and what I call madness for their idea of God. And over against that I've seen the tricks of men. They work hard in hand all together, and in the dark, no man can hold out against them, unless he takes to packing guns, for Mormons are slow to kill. It is the only good I've ever seen in their religion. Ventus, take this from me. These Mormons aren't just right in their minds. Else could a Mormon marry one woman when he already has a wife and call it a duty? Lassiter, you think as I think, returned Ventus. I don't think Zane Grey likes Mormons very much. He's not very nice to them. How'd come then that you never throwed a gun on Tull or some of them? Inquired the rider curiously. Jane pleaded with me, begged me to be patient, to overlook. She even took my guns from me. I lost all before I knew it, replied Ventus, with the red color in his face. But Lassiter, listen. Out of the wreck, I saved a Winchester, 2 Colts, and plenty of shells. I packed these down into Deception Pass. There, almost every day for 6 months, I have practiced with my rifle till the barrel burned my hands, practiced the draw, the firing of a Colt, hour after hour. Now that's interesting to me, said Lassiter, with a quick uplift of his head and a concentration of his grey gaze on Ventus. Could you throw a gun before I began that practicing? Yes, and now? Ventus made a lightning-swift movement. Lassiter smiled, and then his bronzed eyelids narrowed till his eyes seemed mere grey slits. You'll kill Tull. He did not question. He affirmed. I promised Jane Withersteen I'd try to avoid Tull. I'll keep my word. But sooner or later, Tull and I will meet. As I feel now, if he even looks at me, I'll draw. I reckon so. There'll be hell down there presently. He paused a moment and flicked a sagebrush with his quirt. Ventus, seeing as you're considerably worked up, tell me Millie Earn's story. Ventus' agitation stilled to the trace of suppressed eagerness in Lassiter's query. Millie Earn's story? Well, Lassiter, I'll tell you what I know. Millie Earn had been in Cottonwoods years when I first arrived there, and most of what I tell you happened before my arrival. I got to know her pretty well. She was a slip of a woman and crazy on religion. I conceived an idea that I never mentioned. I thought she was at heart more Gentile than Mormon, but she passed as a Mormon, and certainly she had the Mormon woman's locked lips. You know, in every Mormon village there are women who seem mysterious to us, but about Millie there was more than the ordinary mystery. When she came to Cottonwoods, she had a beautiful little girl whom she loved passionately. Millie was not openly known in Cottonwoods as a Mormon wife. That she really was a Mormon wife, I have no doubt. Perhaps the Mormon's other wife or wives would not acknowledge Millie. Such things happen in these villages. Mormon wives wear yokes, but they get jealous. Well, whatever had brought Millie to this country, love or madness of religion, she repented it. She gave up teaching at the village school, she quit the church, and she began to fight Mormon upbringing for her baby girl. Then the Mormons put on the screws, slowly as is their way. At last the child disappeared. Lost, was the report. The child was stolen, I know that, so do you. That wrecked Millie Earn, but she lived in hope. She became a slave. She worked her heart and soul and life out to get back her child. She never heard of it again. Then she sank. I can see her now, a frail thing, so transparent you could almost look through her, white like ashes. And her eyes have always haunted me. She had one real friend, Jane Withersteen, but Jane could not mend a broken heart, and Millie died. For moments, Lassiter did not speak, or turn his head. The man, he exclaimed, presently in husky accents. I haven't the slightest idea who the Mormon was, replied Ventus, nor has any Gentile in Cottonwoods. Does Jane Withersteen know? Yes, but a red-hot running iron couldn't burn that name out of her. Without further speech, Lassiter started off, walking his horse, and Ventus followed with his dogs. Half a mile down the slope, they entered a luxuriant growth of willows and soon came into an open space, carpeted with grass-like deep green velvet. The rushing of water and singing of birds filled their ears. Ventus led his comrade to a shady bower and showed him Amber Spring. It was a magnificent outburst of clear amber water pouring from a dark stone-lined hole. Lassiter knelt and drank, lingered there to drink again. He made no comment, but Ventus did not need words. Next to his horse, a rider of the sage loved a spring. And the spring was the most beautiful and remarkable known to the upland riders of southern Utah. It was the spring that made old Withersteen a feudal lord and now enabled his daughter to return the toll which her father had exacted from the toilers of the sage. The spring gushed forth in a swirling torrent and leaped down joyously to make its swift way along a willow-skirted channel. Moss and ferns and lilies overhung its green banks. Except for the rough-hewn stones that held and directed the water, this willow thicket and glade had been left as nature had made it. Below were artificial lakes, 3 in number, one above the other banks of raised earth, and round about them rose the lofty green foliaged shafts of poplar trees. Ducks dotted the glassy surface of the lakes. A blue heron stood motionless on a water gate. Kingfishers darted with shrieking flight along the shady banks. A white hawk sailed above, and from the trees and shrubs came the song of robins and catbirds. It was all in strange contrast to the endless slopes of lonely sage and the wild rock environs beyond. Ventus thought of the woman who loved the birds and the green of the leaves and the murmur of the water. Next to the slope, just below the third and largest lake, were corrals and a white stone barn, and open sheds and coops and pens. Here were clouds of dust and cracking sounds of hoofs and romping colts and hee-hawing burros. Neighing horses trampled to the corral fences, and on the little windows of the barn projected bobbing heads of bays and blacks and sorrels. When the 2 men entered the immense barnyard, from all around the din increased. This welcome, however, was not seconded by the several men and boys who vanished on sight. Ventus and Lassiter were turning towards the house when Jane appeared in the lane leading a horse. In riding skirt and blouse, she seemed to have lost some of her statuesque proportions and looked more like a girl rider than the mistress of Withersteen. She was brightly smiling, and her greeting was warmly cordial. "Good news," she announced. "I've been to the village. All is quiet." I don't think she speaks like that. "I expected, I don't know what, but there's no excitement. And Tull has ridden out on his way to Glaze." "Tull gone?" inquired Ventus with surprise. He was wondering what could have taken Tull away. Was it to avoid another meeting with Lassiter that he went? Could it have any connection with the probable nearest of Oldring and his gang? "Gone. Yes, thank goodness," replied Jane. Now I'll have peace for a while. Lassiter, I want you to see my horses. You are a rider, and you must be a judge of horseflesh. Some of mine have Arabian blood. My father got his best strain in Nevada from Indians who claimed their horses were bred down from the original stock left by the Spaniards. "Well, ma'am, the one you've been riding takes my eye," said Lassiter as he walked around the racy, clean-limbed, and fine-pointed roan. "Rowan." "Where are the boys?" she asked, looking about. "Jared, Paul, where are you? Here, bring out the horses." The sound of dropping bars inside the barn was a signal for the horses to jerk their heads in the windows, to snort and stamp. Then they came pounding out of the door, a file of thoroughbreds, to plunge about the barnyard, heads and tails up, manes flying. They halted afar off, squared away to look, came slowly forward with whinnies for the mistress and doubtful snorts for the strangers and their horses. "Come, come, come," called Jane, holding out her hands. "Why, bells, wrangle, where are your manners? Come, Blackstar, come, Knight. Oh, you beauties, my races of the sage." Only two came up to her, those she called Knight and Blackstar. Ventus never looked at them without delight. The first was soft, dead black, the other glittering black, and they were perfectly matched in size, both being high and long-bodied, wide through the shoulders, with lithe, powerful legs. That they were women's pets, that they were a woman's pets showed in the gloss of skin, the fineness of mane. It showed too in the light of big eyes and the gentle reach of eagerness. I've never seen their like, was Lasseter's encomium, and in my day I've seen a sight of horses. Now, ma'am, if you was to wanting to make a long and fast ride across the sage, say to elope, Lasseter ended there with dry humor, yet behind that was meaning. Jane blushed and made arch eyes at him. Take care, Lasseter, I might think that a proposal, she replied gaily. It's dangerous to propose elopement to a Mormon woman. Well, I was expecting you. Now will you be a good hour to show? Now would be a good hour to show you Million's grave. The day riders have gone, and the night riders haven't come in. Byrne, what do you make of that? Need I worry? You know I have to be made to worry. Well, it's not usual for the night shift to ride in so late, replied Ventus slowly, and his glance sought Lasseter's. Cattle are usually quiet after dark. Still, I've known even a coyote to stampede your white herd. I refuse to borrow trouble. Come, said Jane. They mounted and, with Jane in the lead, rode down the lane and turning off into a cattle trail, proceeded westwards. Ventus's dogs trotted behind him. On this side of the ranch, the outlook was different from that of the other. The immediate foreground was rough and the sage more rugged and less colorful. There were no dark blue lines of canyons to hold the eye, nor any uprearing rock walls. It was a long roll and slope into gray obscurity. Soon Jane left the trail and rode into the sage, and presently she dismounted and threw her bridle. The men did likewise. Then, on foot, they followed her, coming out at length on the rim of a low escarpment. She passed by several little ridges of earth to halt before a faintly defined mount. It lay in the shade of a sweeping sagebrush, close to the edge of the promontory, and a rider could have jumped his horse over it without recognizing it as a grave. Here. She looked sad as she spoke, but she offered no explanation for the neglect of an unmarked, uncared-for grave. It was a little bunch of pale, sweet lavender daisies. There was a little bunch of pale, sweet lavender daisies, doubtless planted there by Jane. I only come here to remember and to pray, she said, but I leave no trail. A grave in the sage. How lonely this resting place of Million. The cottonwoods or the alfalfa fields were not in sight, nor was there any rock or ridge or cedar to lend contrast to the monotony. Gray slopes tinging the purple, barren and wild. With the wind waving, the sage swept away to the dim horizon. Lasseter looked at the grave and then out into space. At that moment, he seemed a figure of bronze. Jane touched Ventus's arm and led him back to the horses. Byrne, cried Jane, when they were out of hearing. Suppose Lasseter were Millie's husband, the father of that little girl lost so long ago. It might be, Jane. Let us ride on. If he wants to see us again, he'll come. So they mounted and rode out to the cattle trail and began to climb. From the height of the ridge where they had started down, Ventus looked back. He did not see Lasseter, but his glance, drawn irresistibly farther out on the gradual slope, caught sight of a moving cloud of dust. Hello, a rider! Yes, I see, said Jane. That fellow's riding hard. Jane, there's something wrong. Oh, yes, there must be. How he rides! The horse disappeared in the sage, and then puffs of dust marked his course. He's shortcut on us. He's making straight for the corrals. Ventus and Jane galloped the steeds and reined in at the turning of the lane. This lane led down to the right of the grove. Suddenly, into its lower entrance flashed a bay horse. Then Ventus caught the fast rhythmic beat of pounding hoofs. Soon his keen eye recognized the swing of the rider in the saddle. It's Judkins, your Gentile rider, he cried. Jane, when Judkins ride like that, it means hell. Chapter 4. Should we have a break now? We are literally halfway through. So a small break. I'm going to tell you about this stuff, which is weird. Firstly, I can't do accents at all. Like I fuck them up every time. I think I've switched them a few times from last time to now. But there's just so much direct speech, and like I don't know why Ventus had to talk. They had to be made direct speech when he thought about weirdness, like what was going on. That exposition could just as easily have been not direct speech. But there's just a lot of it, and there's just so much setup and so much like mystery. There's the masked man, and then there's milieu, and like those two things, and it's like everything's revolving about that. It's very clear cut what's happening and what's going to happen, more or less. Like it seems to follow the schedule pretty easily. It's also over 100 years old, so that's pretty normal. Very typical for westerns and the like, I assume. I do like it though. It's hilarious. Like some of the stuff is just like what the, yeah. Never mind. Should we just continue? Yeah, fuck it. Chapter 4, Deception Pass. The rider thundered up and almost threw his foam-flecked horse in the sudden stop. He was a giant form and with fearless eyes. "Judkins, you're all bloody," cried Jane in affright. "Oh, you've been shot." "Nothing much, Miss Withersteen. I've got a nick in the shoulder. I'm some wet in the horse, and the horse been throwing lather, so all this ain't blood." I love that. Just, "You've been shot." Well, not particularly. Just a little bit. It's fine. "What's up?" queried Ventus sharply. Times have changed. That is not a sharp request or sharp query anymore. "Rustlers sloped off with the red herd." "Where are my riders?" demanded Jane. "Miss Withersteen, I was alone all night with the herd. At light this morning, the rustlers rode down. They began to shoot at me on sight. They chased me hard and far, burning powder all the time, but I got away." "Judd, they meant to kill you," declared Ventus. "Now I wonder," returned Judkins. "They wanted me bad. And it ain't regular for rustlers to waste time chasing one rider." "Thank heaven you got away," said Jane. "But my riders, where are they?" "I don't know. The night riders weren't there last night when I rode down, and this morning I met no day riders." "Judkins, burn! They've been set upon, killed by Aldring's men." "I don't think so," replied Ventus decidedly. "Jane, your riders haven't gone out in the sage." "Burn, what do you mean?" "You remember what I said about the unseen hand?" "Oh, impossible." "I hope so, but I fear." Ventus finished with a shake of his head. "Burn, you're bitter, but that's only natural. We'll wait to see what's happened to my riders. Judkins, come to the house with me. Your wound must be attended to." "Jane, I'll find out where Aldring drives the herd," bowed Ventus. No, burn, don't risk it now. When the rustlers are in such a shooting mood." "I'm going." "Judd, how many cattle in that red herd?" 2,500 head. Whew. What on earth can Aldring do with so many cattle? Why, 100 head is a big steal. I've got to find out." "Don't go," implored Jane. "Burn, you want a horse that can run. Miss Withersteen, if it's not too bold of me to advise, make him take a fast horse, or don't let him go." Yes, Judkins. He must ride a horse that can't be caught. Which one, Black Star? Knight?" "Jane, I won't take either," said Ventus emphatically. "I wouldn't risk losing one of your favorites." "Wrangle, then." "That's the horse," replied Judkins. "Wrangle can outrun Black Star and Knight. You'd never believe it, Miss Withersteen, but I know. Wrangle's the biggest and fastest horse on this sage." "Oh no, Wrangle can't beat Black Star, but Burn, take Wrangle if you will go. Ask Gerd for anything you need. Oh, be watchful. Careful. Godspeed you." She clasped his hand, turned quickly away, and went down a lane with the rider. Ventus rode to the barn and, leaping off, shouted for Gerd. The boy came running. Ventus sent him for meat, bread, and dried fruits to be packed in saddlebags. His own horse he turned loose into the nearest corral. Then he went for Wrangle. The giant sorrel had earned his name for a trait the opposite of amiability. amiability. He came readily out of the barn, but once in the yard he broke from Ventus and plunged about with ears laid back. Ventus had to rope him, and then he kicked down a section of fence, stood on his hind legs, crashed down and fought the rope. Gerd returned to lend a hand. "Wrangle don't get enough work," said Gerd, as the big saddle went on. "He's unruly, and when he's quarreled, and he wants to run. Wait till he smells the sage. Gerd, this horse is an iron-jawed devil. I've never straddled him but once. Run! Say he's swift as wind." When Ventus' boots touched the stirrup, the sorrel bolted, giving him the rider's flying mount. The swing of this fiery horse recalled to Ventus days that were not really long past, when he rode into the sage as the leader of Jane Withersteen's riders. Wrangle pulled hard and on a tight rein. He galloped out of the lane, down the shady border of the grove, and hauled up at the watering trough, where he pranced and champed his bit. Ventus got off and filled his canteen while the horse drank. The dogs, Ring and Whitey, came trotting up for their drink. Then Ventus remounted and turned Wrangle towards the sage. A wide, white trail wound away from the slope. One keen, sweeping glance told Ventus that there were neither man, nor horse, nor steer within the limit of his vision, unless they were lying down in the sage. Ring loped in the lead, and the Whitey loped in the rear. Wrangle settled gradually into an easy swinging canter, and Ventus' thoughts, now that the rush and flurry of the start were past, and the long miles stretched before him, reverted to a calm reckoning of late singular coincidences. There was the night ride of Tolls, which, viewed in the light of subsequent events, had a look of his covert machinations, Oldring and his masked rider and his rustlers riding muffled horses. The report that Tull had ridden out this morning with his man Jerry on the trails of Glaze, the strange disappearance of Jane Withersteen's riders, the unusually determined attempt to kill one of the Gentiles still in her employ, an intention frustrated, no doubt, only by Judkin's magnificent riding of her racer, and lastly, the driving of the red herd. These events, to Ventus' colour of mind, had a dark relationship. Thankfully, he doesn't have to mutter it to himself. We can just sort of be inside his brain where it's nice and comfy and we don't have to rely on quotation marks. Remembering Jane's accusation of bitterness, he tried hard to put aside his rancor in judging Tull. But it was bitter knowledge that made him see the truth. He had felt the shadow of an unseen hand. He had watched till he saw its dim outline, and then he had traced it to a man's hate, to the rivalry of a Mormon elder, to the power of a bishop, to the long, far-reaching arm of a terrible creed. That unseen hand had made its first move against Jane Withersteen. Her riders had been called in, leaving her without help to drive 7,000 head of cattle. But to Ventus it seemed extraordinary that the power which had called in these riders had left so many cattle to be driven by rustlers and harried by wolves. For hand in glove with that power was an insatiate greed. They were one and the same. "What can Oldring do with 2,500 heads of cattle?" muttered Ventus. There he is. There he goes, muttering again. "Is he a Mormon? Did he meet Tull last night? It looks like a black plot to me. But Tull and his churchmen wouldn't ruin Jane Withersteen unless the church was to profit by that ruin. Where does Oldring come in? I'm going to find out about these things." Wrangle did the 25 miles in 3 hours and walked little of the way. When he had gotten warmed up, he had been allowed to choose his own gait. The afternoon had well advanced when Ventus struck the trail of the red herd and found where it had grazed the night before. Then Ventus rested the horse and used his eyes. Near at hand were a cow and a calf and several yearlings, and farther out in the sage some straggling steers. He caught a glimpse of coyotes skulking near the cattle. The slow sweeping gaze of the rider failed to find the other living things within the field of sight. The sage about him was breast high to his horse, oversweet with its warm, fragrant breath, grey where it waved to the light, darker where the wind left it still, and beyond the wonderful haze purple lent by distance. Far across that wide waste began the slow lift of uplands through which Deception Pass cut its tortuous, many-canyoned way. Ventus raised the bridle of his horse and followed the broad cattle trail. The crushed sage resembled the path of a monster snake. In a few miles of travel, he passed several cows and calves that had escaped the drive. Then he stood on the last high bench of the slope with the floor of the valley beneath. The opening of the canyon showed in a break of the sage, and the cattle trail paralleled it, as far as he could see. That trail led to an undiscovered point where Oldring drove cattle into the pass, and many a rider who had followed it had never returned. Ventus satisfied himself that the rustlers had not deviated from their usual course, and then he turned at right angles off the cattle trail and made for the head of the pass. The sun lost its heat and wore down to the western horizon, where it changed from white to gold and rested like a huge ball about to roll on its golden shadows down the slope. Ventus watched the lengthening of the rays and bars and marveled at his own league-long shadow. The sun sank. There was an instant shading of brightness about him, and he saw a kind of cold purple bloom creep ahead of him to cross the canyon, to mount the opposite side of the opposite slope and chase and darken and bury the last golden flare of sunlight. Ventus rode into a trail that he always took to get down into the canyon. He dismounted and found no tracks but his own made days previously. Nevertheless, he set the dog Ring ahead and waited. In a little while, Ring returned, whereupon Ventus led his horse on to the break in the ground. The opening into Deception Pass was one of the remarkable natural phenomena in a country remarkable for vast slopes of sage, uplands insulated by gigantic red walls, and deep canyons of mysterious source and outlet. Here the valley floor was level, and here opened a narrow chasm, and a ragged vent in yellow walls of stone. The trail going down 500 feet of sheer depth always tested Ventus' nerve. It was bad going even for a burro. But Wrangle, as Ventus led him, snorted defiance and disgust rather than fear, and, like a hobbled horse on the jump, lifted his ponderous iron-shod forehoofs and crashed down over the first rough step. Ventus warmed to the greater admiration of the sorrel, and, giving him a loose bridle, he stepped down foot by foot. Oftentimes the stones and shales started by Wrangle buried Ventus to his knees. Again he was hard put to it to judge a rolling boulder. There were times when he could not see Wrangle for dust, and once he and the horse rode a sliding shelf of yellow weathered cliff. It was a trail on which there could be no stops, and therefore, if perilous, it was at least one that did not take long in the descent. Ventus breathed lighter when it was over, and felt a sudden assurance in the success of his enterprise. For at first it had been a reckless determination to achieve something at any cost, and now it resolved itself into an adventure worthy of all his reason and cunning and keenness of eye and ear. Pinyon pines clustered in little clumps along the level floor of the pass. Twilight had gathered under the walls, and Ventus rode into the trail and up the canyon. Gradually, the trees and caves and objects low down turned black, and this blackness moved up the walls till night enfolded the pass, while day still lingered above. And this blackness moved up the walls till night enfolded the pass, while day still lingered above. There we go. The sky darkened and stars began to show, at first pale, then bright. Sharp notches of the rim wall, biting like teeth into blue, were landmarks by which Ventus knew where his camping site lay. He had to feel his way through a thicket of slender oaks to a spring where he watered Wrangle and drank himself. Here he unsaddled and turned Wrangle loose, having no fear that the horse would leave the thick, cool grass adjacent to the spring. Next he satisfied his own hunger, fed Ring and Whitey, and, with them curdled beside him, composed himself to await sleep. There had been a time when night in the high altitude of these Utah uplands had been satisfying to Ventus, but that was before the oppression of enemies had made the change in his mind. As a rider guarding the herd, he had never thought of the night's wildness and loneliness. As an outcast, now when the full silence set in, and the deep darkness and trains of radiant stars shone cold and calm, he lay with an ache in his heart. For a year he had lived as a black fox, driven from his kind. He longed for the sound of a voice, the touch of a hand. In the daytime, there was riding from place to place, the gun practice to which something drove him, and other tasks that at least necessitated action. At night, before he won sleep, there was strife in his soul. Let's do that again. That's couldn't quite figure that out. In the daytime, there was riding from place to place, and the gun practice to which something drove him, and other tasks that at least necessitated action. At night, before he won sleep, there was strife in his soul. There we go. He yearned to leave these endless sage slopes, the wilderness of canyons, and it was in the lonely night that this yearning grew unbearable. It was then that he reached forth to feel Ring or Whitey, immeasurably grateful for the love and companionship of two dogs. On this night, the same old loneliness beset Ventus. The old habit of sad thoughts and burning unquiet had its way, but it evolved from a conviction that his useless life had undergone a subtle change. He had sensed it first when Wrangle swung him up the high saddle. He knew it now when he lay in the gateway of Deception Pass. He had no thrill of adventure, rather a gloomy perception of great hazard, perhaps death. He meant to find Oldring's retreat. The rustlers had fast horses, but none that could catch Wrangle. Ventus knew no rustler could creep up upon him at night when Ring and Whitey guarded his hiding place. For the rest, he had eyes and ears, and a long rifle and an unerring aim, which he meant to use. Strangely, his foreshadowing of change did not hold a thought for the killing of Tull. It related only to what was happening to him in Deception Pass, and he could no more lift the veil of that mystery and tell where the trails led into that unexplored canyon. Moreover, he did not care. At length, tired out by stress of thought, he fell asleep. I wouldn't be surprised if Tull turns out to be just, the good guy, more or less, and it's somebody else that's the baddie. But maybe I've just read too many modern novels. This is probably going to be more or less straightforward, but I don't know. When his eyes unclosed, day had come again, and he saw the rim of the opposite wall tipped with a gold sunrise. A few moments sufficed for the morning's simple camp duties. Near at hand, he found Wrangle, and to his surprise, the horse came to him. Wrangle was one of those horses that left his viciousness in the home corral. What he wanted was to be free of mules and burros and steers, to roll in dust patches, and then run down the wide, open, windy sage plains, and at night browse and sleep in the cool, wet grass of a spring hole. Gerd knew the sorrow when he had said of him, "Wait till he smells the sage." Ventus saddled and let him out of the oak thicket, and leaping astride, rode up the canyon with Ring and Whitey trotting behind. An old grass-grown trail followed the course of a shallow wash where An old grass-grown trail followed the course of a shallow wash where flowed a thin stream of water. The canyon was 100 rods wide. Its yellow walls were perpendicular. It had abundant sage and a scant growth of oak and pinon. For 5 miles, it held to a comparatively straight bearing, and then began a heightening of rugged walls and a deepening of the floor. Beyond this point of sudden change in the character of the canyon, Ventus had never explored. Beyond this point of sudden change in the character of the canyon, Ventus had never explored, and here was the real door to the intricacies of Deception Pass. He reined Wrangle to a walk, halted now and then to listen. He halted now and then to listen, and then proceeded cautiously with shifting and alert gaze. The canyon assumed proportion that dwarfed those of its first 10 miles. Ventus rode on and on, not losing, in the interest of his wide surroundings, any of his caution or keen search for tracks or sights of living things. If there had ever been a trail here, he could not find it. He rode through sage and clumps of pinion trees, and grassy plots where long-petaled purple lilies bloomed. He rode through a dark constriction of the pass no wider than the lane in the grove at Cottonwoods, and he came out into a great amphitheater, into which jutted huge towering corners of confluence of intersecting canyons. Ventus sat his horse, and with a rider's eye studied this wild cross-cut of huge stone gullies. Then he went on, guided by this course of running water. If it had not been for the main stream of water flowing north, he would never have been able to tell which of those many openings was a continuation of the pass. In crossing this amphitheater, he went by the mouths of 5 canyons, fordering little streams that flowed into the larger one. Gaining the outlet, which he took to be the pass, he rode on again under overhanging walls. One side was dark in shade, the other light in sun. This narrow passageway turned and twisted and opened into a valley that amazed Ventus. Here and again was a sweep of purple sage, richer than upon the higher levels. The valley was miles long, several wide, and enclosed by unscalable walls. But it was the background of this valley that so forcibly struck him. Across the sage flat rose a strange upflinging of yellow rocks. He could not tell which were close and which were distant. Scrawled mounds of stone, like mountain waves, seemed to roll up to steep bare slopes and towers. In this plain of sage, Ventus flushed birds and rabbits, and when he had proceeded about a mile, he caught sight of the bobbing white tails of a herd of running antelope. He rode along the edge of the stream, which wound towards the western end of the slowly looming mounds of stone. The high slope retreated out of sight behind the nearer protection. To Ventus, the valley appeared to have been filled by a mountain of melted stone that had hardened in strange shapes of rounded outline. He followed the stream till he lost it in a deep cut. Therefore, Ventus quit the dark slit which baffled further search in that direction and rode out along the curved edge of stone where it met the sage. It was not long before he came to a low place, and here Wrangle readily climbed up. All about him was ridgy roll of wind smooth. All about him was ridgy roll of wind smooth, rain-washed rock. There we go. Not a tuft of grass or a bunch of sage colored the dull rust yellow. He saw where, to the right, this uneven floor of stone ended in a blunder wall. Leftwards, from the hollow that lay at his feet, mounted a gradual, slow swelling slope to a great height topped by leaning, cracked, and ruined crags. Not for some time did he grasp the wonder of that acclivity. It was no less than a mountainside, glistening in the sun like polished granites, with cedar trees springing as if by magic out of the denuded surface. Winds had swept clear of weathered shale, and rains had washed it free of dust. Far up the curved slope, its beautiful lines broke to meet the vertical rim wall. To lose its grace in different order and color of rock, a stained yellow cliff of cracks and caves and seamed cracks. And straight before Ventus was a scene less striking but more significant to his keen survey. For beyond a mile of the bare, hummocky rock began the Valley of Sage, and the mouths of canyons, one of which surely was another gateway into the pass. He got off his horse, and giving the bridle to Ring to hold, he commenced a search for the cleft where the stream ran. He was not successful, and concluded the water dropped into an underground passage. Then he returned to where he had left Wrangle and led him down the stone to the sage. It was a short ride to the opening canyons. There was no reason for a choice of which one to enter. The one he rode into was a clear, sharp shaft in yellow stone 1,000 feet deep, with wonderful wind-worn caves, low down and high above buttressed and turreted ramparts. Farther on, Ventus came into a region where deep indentations marked the line of canyon walls. These were huge, cove-like blind pockets extending back to a sharp corner with a dense growth of underbrush and trees. Ventus penetrated into one of these offshoots, and as he had hoped, he found abundant grass. He had to bend the oak saplings to get his horse through. Deciding to make this a hiding place if he could find water, he worked back to the limits of the shelving walls. In a little cluster of silver spruces, he found a spring. This enclosed nook seemed an ideal place to leave his horse and to camp at night, and from which to make stealthy trips on foot. The thick grass hid his trail. The dense growth of oaks in the opening would serve as a barrier to keep Wrangle in, if indeed the luxuriant browse would not suffice for that. So Ventus, leaving Whitey with the horse, called Ring to his side, and rifle in hand worked his way out into the open. A careful photographing in mind of the formation of the bold outlines of rim rock assured him he would be able to return to his retreat even in the dark. Bunches of scattered sage covered the center of the canyon, and among these Ventus threaded his way with the step of an Indian. At intervals, he put his hand on the dog and stopped to listen. There was a drowsy hum of insects, but no other sound disturbed the warm midday stillness. Ventus saw ahead a turn more abrupt than any yet. Warily he rounded this corner, once again to halt bewildered. The canyon opened fan-shaped into a great oval of green and grey growths, and it was the hub of an oblong wheel, and from it, at regular distances, like spokes, ran the outgoing canyons. Sorry, a second. Here, a dull red color predominated over the fading yellow. The corners of wall bluntly rose, scarred and scrawled, to taper into towers and serrated peaks and pinnacled domes. Ventus pushed on more heedfully than ever. Towards the center of the circle, the sagebrush grew smaller and farther apart. He was about to sheer off to the right, where thickets and jumbles of fallen rock would afford him cover, when he ran right upon a broad cattle trail. Like a road it was, more than a trail, and the cattle tracks were fresh. What surprised him more, they were wet. He pondered over this feature. It had not rained. The only solution to this puddle was that the cattle had been driven through water, and water deep enough to wet their legs. Suddenly, Ring rolled low. Ventus rose cautiously and looked over the sage. A band of straggling horsemen were riding across the oval. He sank down, startled and trembling. "Rustlers," he muttered. Hurriedly, he glanced about for a place to hide. Near at hand, there was nothing but sagebrush. He dared not risk crossing the open patches to reach the rocks. Again, he peeped over the sage. The rustlers, 4, 5, 7, 8 in all, were approaching, but not directly in line with him. That was a relief, for a cold deadness which seemed to be creeping inwards along. Which seemed to be creeping inwards along his veins. He crouched down with bated breath and held the bristling dog. He heard the click of iron-shod hoofs on stone, the coarse laughter of men, and then the voices gradually dying away. Long moments passed. Then he rose. The rustlers were riding into a canyon. The horses were tired, and they had several pack animals. Evidently, they had traveled far. Ventus doubted that they were the rustlers who had driven the red herd. Olding's band had split. Ventus watched these horsemen disappear under a bold canyon wall. The rustlers had come from the northwest side of the oval. Ventus kept a steady gaze in that direction, hoping, if there were more, to see from what canyon they rode. A quarter of an hour went by. Reward for his vigilance came when he descried 3 more mounted men, far over to the north. But out of what canyon they had ridden it was too late to tell. He watched the 3 ride across the oval and round the jutting red corner up where the others had gone. "Up that canyon!" exclaimed Ventus. "Aldring's den! I've found it!" A knotty point for Ventus was the fact that the cattle tracks all pointed west. The broad trail came from the direction of the canyon into which the rustlers had ridden, and undoubtedly the cattle had been driven out of it across the oval. There was no tracks pointing the other way. It had been in his mind that Oldring had driven the red herd towards the rendezvous, and not from it. Where did that broad trail come down into the pass, and where did it lead? Ventus knew that he wasted time in pondering the question, but it held a fascination not easily dispelled. For many years, Oldring's mysterious entrance and exit to Deception Pass had been all-absorbing topics to sage riders. All at once, the dog put an end to Ventus' pondering. Ring sniffed the air, turned slowly in his tracks with a whine, and then growled. Ventus wheeled. 2 horsemen were within 100 yards, coming straight at him. One lagging behind the other, was Aldring's masked rider. Ventus cunningly sank, slowly trying to emerge into sagebrush, but guarded as his action was, the first horse detected it. He stopped short, snorted, and shot up his ears. The rustler bent forward as if keenly peering ahead. Then, with a swift sweep, he jerked a gun from its sheath and fired. The bullets sipped through the sagebrush, flying bits of wood struck Ventus, and the hot, stinging pain seemed to lift him one leap. Like a flash, the blue barrel of his rifle gleamed level, and he shot once, twice. The foremost rustler dropped his weapon and toppled from his saddle, to fall with his foot catching in a stirrup. The horse snorted wildly and plunged away, dragging the rustler through the sage. The masked rider huddled over his pommel, slowly swaying to one side, and then, with a faint, strange cry, slipped out of the saddle. And that is the end of the chapter. I think I'm just going to upload this directly, not going to take anything out of it. Just going to leave it there. All the errors. And the tiny 2-minute intermission in the middle. Yeah, anyway. Thanks for listening. I'm actually, I haven't read more than this. I know exactly what you have read. I just read it like just before I start, so that's going to be interesting next time as well. I want to say something. Yeah, I'm considering just doing it in 30 minutes rather than having a whole hour, and then just do it twice. And I'm also considering to stop doing it live because nobody's listening anyway. So maybe just doing 2 half-hour ones and then uploading it at set times rather than doing that. It's not going to be done until the next book, so not until like late December, I suppose. But I might just experiment with it at some point. I don't know. Thanks for listening anyway. I don't know why you need to know that now, but here you are. Bye.